The Elite Woman, The Season of Asiyah, January 2020, Chapter 2.1 of the Maternalist Quartet series by Leila Halzian. Known as asiyahbintmuzahim, this means Asiyah, daughter of Muzahim, Muzahim as in the one who clashed. Was she born with a silver spoon in her mouth? What was it like being a princess and then married to the leader of such a prominent nation at the height of its grandeur? How much was the uptown girl coming from a point of privilege, seriously coming from a point of pampered privilege and dripping indulgence if researching the environment of those days? She had greater leverage than Marie Antoinette in all her ruffles and ribbons. Although her style may have been more practical in its elegance and more visually sleek, it was more in keeping with the cosmopolitan preference of ancient civilizations and warmer climates, cooled by river water and gentle palm leaves. Still, many other societies at their peak gravitate towards simple lines while consolidating so many cultures around the world. Think of the Great Gatsby of the 1920s and the Western world's gravitation towards the sleek modernism complemented by African geometrics, including Egyptian grandeur. It's this very absorption of variety that contributes to the height of any empire, but at the same time also encourages the, quote, modern style to be simple and edgy. Queen Asiyah was perched at the very top of the social pyramid through her marriage to the one man and his recent forefathers who took over and sustained this ungodly hierarchy. The rivers run parallel, so it's important to consider the link to Prophet Yusuf and before him Prophet Ibrahim, peace be upon them both. The Quran refers to the leaders of Egypt in their respective eras as kings and not pharaohs. As the ruler was called in the time of Prophet Musa, aka Moses, it corrects the Bible here, but in doing so validates it in many other areas, while showing the excessive consolidation of control in Egyptian government from one generation to the later. Pharaoh means house. The ruler was so powerful that he wasn't the head of the government or the state, but he was the government and he was the state. He serves as a convenient personification of total political rule. In other words, he was the man. Think of the expression, stick it to the man. His wife, along with his many other wives, was to enjoy the benefits of being above the indulged minority within the class system that would come to repeat itself throughout the ages up until now. The system relies on compliance. At the expense of the masses, her husband sought to establish himself as a god above others by placing himself at the very top with his nobles and henchmen beneath. Then the rest of the working class below, with the disenfranchised Israelites as a minority and other slaves making the base. This base was feeding their economy from the very bottom for the sake of increased profit margin. Those at the bottom must be accustomed to less, not just in materials, but less in rights and recognition. Egypt was dripping in gold, so much so that the children of Israel, or Israel, had so much on them that they could later build a calf statue. This is proof that the story isn't made up, as how were the scholars of both the Hebrew scriptures and the prophet of the Quran to know that mere slaves could be carrying so much gold out of Egypt? Think about it. If you were to write a fiction about this very topic, would you think to include heaps of gold as being on their person? Scriptures mention this, but archaeologists later confirmed that gold was so common in Egypt that it littered the streets and wasn't as valued as wood, which was imported, or silver like the earrings that Queen Nefertari got from Greece, which were her prized possessions. Was she a co-wife to Asiyah and married to the same pharaoh? We'll see, inshallah. Back to Bani Israel. They were the descendants of Yusuf, otherwise known as Joseph, as mentioned before, and his brothers who joined him in Egypt after he became minister. They the sons of Prophet Yaqub, otherwise known as Jacob, and Israel, hence they were called Bani Israel. Children of Israel were to continue their monotheist religion of only worshipping God through many generations among Egyptian society until it displeased the pharaohs and they found themselves punished by enslavement and oppressed to the lowest of the classes, peace be upon the prophets. Much like Muslims and certain people of scripture today, like the leverage of the state's favor because they don't worship the government, corporations, fashion media, brands, and labels. At least sincere believers, for the most part, don't get as caught up in these things as they would have been without Islam giving structured focus towards God's oneness and implemented daily. Muslims generally, as a collective, are distant from banks, usury, gambling, and porn with various raunchy entertainment and substance abuse, or so we would like to think. Noam Chomsky is known to be an authority on modern Western history, especially among more socialist circles, and very critical of the West's imperial involvement in the world, but at the same time ignorant about Islam. He said that Muslims are basically, quote, getting it in the neck for not conforming to the latest pyramid structure that involves corporations influencing media, media defining politics, and politicians buying or investing in corporations. The truth is that if all the Muslims who make up 1/5 of the world's population were to all leave Islam, then these other sectors of industry would see an increase. The state can only dream. In the meantime, the Muslim population worldwide feeds the bottom of the new social pyramids by fleeing their war torn homes and struggling to find refuge with the elite European countries indoctrinated in their self righteous Islamophobia. Here, many people fall through the cracks and become victims of trafficking, various abuse, and slave labor if not harvested for organs. These schisms fit nicely into the new agenda to create gods above others by stripping masses of basic human rights to education, safety, and provision. They become desperate and easy to manipulate into submission. I'm not just talking about what, quote, conspiracy theorists, in quote, touch on, but basic social scientific phenomena based on observation throughout history as documented factually. This constant monopolizing of society through various sectors is in stark contrast to La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, because it's a system created by the minority elite or one man pharaoh to compete as a God or try to be God, to others denying their basic rights to a balanced, holistic lifestyle that progresses under the truth of God's oneness, who created us to be free slaves. Throughout history, this has reincarnated as the caste system of India, the imperialism of Rome, and colonialism, the class system of medieval Europe. Even more colonialism, Pretty Paris has been built with African blood, and the evolving slavery systems until racial segregation, as seen in the US and other parts of the world, including apartheid South Africa. The rich are still getting richer, the poor are still getting poorer. The relationship between corporates, engineering media, and influencing government is still creating that divide to increase the profit margin by exploiting the desperation and ignorance of the masses. Already, the working class is inclined to define themselves according to their social identity, even if they're not strictly speaking working. The term applies to any group that is not at the level of management or high professionalism. This disposition affects people's political views due to having a subjective sense of self. They are easy to influence through gateway context in home, school, and work, therefore also religion. The lower class experiences hard interdependence because they have no other sense of control and are thus clingier or more desperate for the scraps thrown down by the so called protectors above them. Think of Gene Hackman's character in Mississippi Burning describing his father killing the mule of his black neighbor because he, quote, hated being poor. Not justify, but just, quote, a story about my daddy. Or is it a story about mankind? So to flip a coin, the middle to upper class demonstrates expressive independence because they have more affluence and more sense of control over their lives, or better put, a perceived sense of control. They worry less about meeting ends meet or overcoming persistent threats and enjoy the liberty of their, quote, rebellion. They don't feel compelled to toe the line, but they seek to influence their social context and diverge on their interests until they completely outperform others and create a greater divide in the upward mobility from lower classes. This can happen intentionally and unintentionally. The upper class score lower on empathy in reading social cues, hence Marie Antoinette saying, let the peasants eat cake, and are typically less invested or aware, hence they appear stuck up or aloof, since they are in a cycle of subtle indoctrination to prioritize their feelings and senses, leading to more inhibition and less social openness that connects to the joy shared with others. This can be seen in fewer head nods or lack of eye contact, or a blonde Hollywood actress dressing up little black boys in pink tutus, while middle class liberals call her objectors bigots with no sensitivity to the offended African American community who already feel so castrated in their collective psyche, but I digress. Material conditions have a lasting impact on the development of people's upbringing. This adds to the lower class people being more inclined to be attached to their tribal identity and bonds of belonging. They have a lower sense of personal control, which leads to a higher sense of conformity. Working class score higher in empathy and are more likely to be helpful, hence Steve Biko's observation regarding the white culture being self-serving and South African black culture being more social or community-orientated back in the day. However, there is the view that lower or working class tend to be more anti-immigrant or xenophobic. This quality is researched and discovered across all classes, with the lower class being more provoked towards aggression due to a feeling of powerlessness. Remember the quote story about my daddy killing the neighbor's mule. Besides that, lower classes are more socially engaged, for example, pints at the pub or shebeen. They are interdependent and sensitive to the way social events shape their emotions. For example, the French Revolution or South African toy-toying and soccer mobs around the world. They're better at reading facial cues and explaining decisions based on situational rather than dispositional factors. Therefore, they recognize distress better and are more inclined to socialism, and they tend to be more pro-welfare. The tribal consciousness from rural areas and from pre-colonial times, where people were more in their fitra state of early human existence, is seen here but twisted into gangsterism through other toxic influences. Marketers and corporates know exactly how to exploit and manipulate the insecurities of the public by creating a feeling of tribalism. Advertisers admit to this and use it as an effective tool to upsell products to existing buyers or prospects. The lower class defines itself in contextual terms, whereas the upper class defines itself in solipsis terms. Contextual means that people will justify their decision making based on situations and circumstances, while solipsis are more focused on energy and emotion. NLP and this kind of magic are thus very attractive to the elite and feed into the conspiracy theorist narrative further. A poor Muslim might identify with verses in the Quran and Hadith report that promote making excuses for others, while a wealthier Muslim might gravitate to the verse, quote, Allah doesn't change a person's condition until they change who they are in themselves, and sees the poverty of others as being their fault instead of appreciating that others have been tested unfairly by the system, although there's great truth in the verse in a broader universal term. Since the elites score lower in their ability to read social cues, the African working class complains about white or Indian middle to upper class demonstrating specific narcissistic tendencies. Due to solipsism, some of the wealthy see the lower class as lazy, lacking will, or even less intelligent or less enlightened, with the justification of, quote, we attract according to our energy, so they must have attracted their poverty with their negative thinking and lower energy field, end quote. The neoliberal ideology in the UK and internationally that's dominated most of the Western world and industrialized societies in the past 3 decades has gained so much momentum that even the Labour parties have developed a prejudice against the unemployed. And this is part of the divide and conquer still. Another and more obvious way that the status quo is maintained is that youth are taught to be employees, not investors. Subjects are segregated and disconnected. The school system only accommodates a minority of children while the rest struggle to keep up with work, thus creating more desperation in the future masses. Women are employed instead of men because they are paid less, and if they are paid more, it's because they are juggling extra workload. But the company still gets a huge discount off wages as a result. BEE ensures that people from townships are satisfied with less pay than those from middle-class backgrounds. Sexual psycho-molestation from the media and entertainment is used to further damage the minds while brainwashing the public in much the same way cults use sexual abuse to trap their followers in their reptilian brains so that they can think with their higher minds for them, so they can't think with their higher minds for themselves. The gun flooding in the areas, the substances, the pollution, the gangs ranking at 26 or 28 degrees, just another pyramid, but here a man has to rape his way to the top or allow himself to be degraded in that way. The Darwinian model fueling racism, justifying racial abuse, the breakdown of womankind and traumatizing the youth, traditional family units cracking apart. There are just so many strategies used to ensure that this pyramid of stacking poor souls at the bottom so that a few can indulge in unlimited pleasure keeps going. The slave mill keeps grinding and is grinding still. So back to Firawn. He is the absolute best example or archetype of the fascist personification for manipulation and control, as said before. It has also been said that Pharaoh, the fascist dictator, was the worst man ever, worse than Hitler, worse than Mussolini, and the celebrated serial rapists and traffickers who are considered to have, quote, founded the lands. If you understandably hate any of these men, then you will hate Pharaoh because he was even worse than all of them for other reasons that will be discussed in the next chapter. Pharaoh is the ultimate narcissistic fascist in his grip and control over all aspects of citizens' life by any means necessary. His wife, by default, is in the secluded but public world, perhaps unwittingly and unintentionally. She was born, raised, and married into this position, but she was cushioned within this cocoon of luxury and refined comfort. With strong immunity as queen, she got to float through the palaces and temples nice and easy, or did she? Who was she in the context of history, and how did she get along with her in laws? Regardless of the experience of middle class lifestyle might be problematic to someone accustomed to highbrow living, let's unpack a bit. The definition of abuse is to create a feeling of suspense. So the definition of abuse is to create a feeling of suspense. Abuse is haram. It means all abuse is illegal. Therefore, creating a feeling of suspense is haram. Therefore, preventing a feeling of suspense is good and praiseworthy, as well as blessed with the correct intention. We don't torture animals to death when they are being slaughtered for food. We don't let them see each other be cut or frighten them in any way. According to the Quran, the husband can't leave his wife hanging and wondering about the relationship because it's a form of abuse. It's psychological abuse. It's encouraged that when a man marries a woman, he spends on her according to how her father spent on her so that she could enjoy a similar lifestyle as the one she had before she got married, if not better. Why? Because going from upper to lower class can be traumatic, and a woman marrying a man in a lower socioeconomic position should be conscious and aware of this. Many do choose that, but there has to be that awareness. It is befitting, according to this logic, that a princess marries into royalty and becomes the wife of the king. This has been the logic of even pagan ancient civilizations throughout the world, including Egypt, especially that of Egypt, since they were all about keeping the, quote, bloodlines pure, end quote. This was the topmost priority to the point of incest. It has been noted that people coming from middle to upper class environments have experienced mental shock going into the slums of the new urban social pyramid system, but not necessarily of rural areas that are more akin to the fit or natural state. American university students volunteering in the underprivileged areas of South African society have been observed coming out of the townships as if tripping off something, yet not on anything. They look dazed and confused, as if disorientated, but respond better in natural environments. The quote slums are unnatural man-made poverty, so much like smoking a cigarette. It has a desensitizing effect on those who are continuously exposed to it. But those who are new to the experience are overwhelmed by the toxicity of it and visual chaos. So let me say that again. Those who are new to the experience are overwhelmed by the toxicity of it and the visual chaos. A new smoker feels the poison creeping into the brain as if the body shouts, "Don't do this to me." This says something about the man-made slums and the urgency to change them through land reform and decent housing for the majority still squatting at the bottom of the South African socio-economic pyramid. We're used to this reality, and being accustomed to the reality blinds us to the greater danger of it and how it may affect us all in the long run. So here is the tipping point. The wife of Pharaoh enjoyed the health, comfort, security, and luxury that the richest of more affluent white South Africans and people from first world countries can only dream of. If you look at the body language of the elite, their posture, features, and attitude all harmoniously sing of easy breezy bliss. They have access to the best of everything, including a lifestyle that is organic, pure, clean, and free of cheap materials that introduce toxins. They can attain the best nutrition, medication, and various forms of therapy, be it energetic or otherwise. It's easier for them to reach maximum health and enjoy the mental focus and sense of emotional closure that comes with it. Extensive research shows that the upper class get less sick than the lower class because of less exposure to public germs. They get better quality and quantity of sleep with less stress overall. The working class have less security, are more in a state of hypervigilance, trapped in fight or flight mode, and with less access to nutrients and healthy eating. So how do we compare this to the Queen of Egypt? She could have easily felt strong or at least physically secure, alert, awake, fresh, clean, and calm. Picture this minority scattered along the coast and filling up the trendy coffee bars and hipster joints. They be, chilling and just absorb the experience, not caring about money or how much they spend, completely free of burdens and continuous mental mathematics that the poor do when they spend money. Like Daisy Buchanan of The Great Gatsby, stretching up her hands to flirt with the air above her, while soft lavender camise and pretty light filters the spacious room. There's a lightness about them, a freedom. Now, too, a few of the new black elite or black diamonds have this frivolous spring in their step in post-apartheid South Africa. The elite usually reclines, talking much ado about nothing and having a really good time, and not just the pretense of the selfie opportunity. Their non-verbal communication has a side about it that says, I'm okay, and I'm enough. I have enough. At the very least, the pretense of it. I can imagine the ancient queen strolling with a soft smile, and she might have been oblivious to the hardships on the ground level, much like Marie Antoinette was too cocooned by the ruffles and baubles of her finery, far removed and aware of the masses stirred against her. Which was a pity, because had she been aware, she could have used her entrepreneurial genius to boost the economy and save her own life along with her family, but I digress. Not much is known about Asiyah in this regard, except, as already mentioned, that she was the wife of the most imperialist and grandiose of fascist dictators. Yet, weirdly enough, research shows that working class people endorse and preserve a social system that materially disadvantages them. It's called the system justification hypothesis, and is observed in underprivileged communities like in Bani Israeeatin, as in the case of the man fighting with a soldier, in the story of Musa alayhi salam, and in South Africa today, where self-sabotage and the blocking of others is prevalent, with the insistence of unnecessary red tape bureaucracy. Think of strict nurses in the hyper-industrialized wards, disciplining patients in need of nurturing while squashing them through the sausage factory that is the state hospital. People who suffer the most from the given state of affairs are less likely to question, challenge, reject, or change it. It's like a form of collective Stockholm syndrome. The Stockholm Syndrome. This prediction stems from cognitive dissonance theory, in that it is psychologically inconsistent to experience oppression but not protest the system that carries it out. Like cases of domestic violence, on some level and in some twisted way, the victim is hoping for some sort of validation or compensation on a subconscious level. People who benefit from the system are more likely to question it because they are mentally relaxed enough to do so. Think of the genius in the bathtub having an epiphany. The privileged are not stuck in their reptilian brains and think more creatively or laterally from the cerebral. It's only when people are faced with perceived threat they become irrational, hence the xenophobia in South Africa among the working class, while anti-immigration grows among the extremist groups from the Trump supporters who are not of the elite. Not that there aren't points to be heard. There was a specific group from the white South African camp who weren't racist towards black civilians until after 1994 elections, which was followed by BEE, in much the same way that the elite only protest immigration when their economy stability seems threatened, in much the same way whites take issue with land reform, seeing it as a threat to their economic situation. The higher class are more likely to show unethical acts like lying in negotiation, bribery, and cheating, with an overall attitude of entitlement. The lack of ethics seems to be more specifically targeted towards the interests of the self, with reduced concern for the welfare of others. This was the point of Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, with Buchanan's fleeing from responsibility leading to the social injustice of the book's climax. Now for the height of the example in the attitude of entitlement. Pharaoh was the ruler of the world. He was the, quote, lord of everything they dealt with, and that was accepted by their public, whether they're monotheists or not. In much the same way we just accept that the government is in charge and assume that those elected will do what's right, is the apparent job of a small minority of statespeople to fix everything. Politicians promise jobs, housing, education, and security, and if they were honest, then they would at least admit to themselves that this isn't even a possibility regardless of the intentions. It is socially, scientifically impossible for a few to take care of the masses. We have been treating them like, quote, gods, in that we hand over our worlds to them and expect them to do better than us. Civilizations have thrived from the grassroots level, where leadership is seen to blossom from the ground up, not the top down. Ancient Egypt, Rome, and Greece were only advanced by leveraging the weight, materialism, and schooling of other nations, with the impact only affecting a few. So can they be called great civilizations? The same can be argued for the Sumerians and later Babylonians along the Fertile Crescent. When Muslims thrived during the Golden Era, it was due to the culmination of other experts from other religions like Christianity and Judaism, as well as other nations. Muslim scholars never denied this or pretended that they were alone in the great advancements of math, science, and other disciplines. However, it was a true advancement in civilizations when we consider that there was upward mobility overall and even among the low income brackets. As evil as Pharaoh was, there's no sign that he was harsh with Asiyah initially, and here's why. There's a report to suggest that he was relatively pleased with his wife's easygoing nature and was less likely to be punishing towards her. She also seemed confident enough to assert her desire to adopt a baby boy from Bani Israel at a time when they were all being put to death. She speaks with an assumption that she will get her way, and she did, as we'll see in the next chapter, inshallah. It's easy to assume that she could do and have whatever she wanted. She wasn't necessarily oppressed if she was amicable to her husband, who also had other women to keep him busy to free up her time with leisure. On condition that white South Africans enjoyed their beer and rugby, they were rewarded for their complacency unless they joined the resistance. Then they would suffer cruel treatment, but not as much as those from the, quote, lower ranks of the system. This is still a trend in a variety of ways. So much like the passive people, the passive wife was arranged to be married to Pharaoh, and concubines were an accepted reality. She wasn't necessarily attached to him, nor he have necessarily been the love of her life, although she would come to find a greater love elsewhere. Until then, there seemed to be some sort of agreeable civility between them. It's important to unpack the aspects of being upper class within the context of the story. If we consider the fire ruby-like existence of such exquisite refinement, then we can better appreciate the crushing severity of the sadistic torture she later endured as much as we can then appreciate the great testament of faith that comes with that action of intense endurance. It is this example of power from the conviction that demonstrates the Queen of Egypt as one of the greatest women of perfect faith. God's pleasure and peace be upon Asiyah, who was to be embraced by the ultimate ruler and king of all domain and freed from this deceptive world into true spiritual luxury. And on that topic, it's interesting to note that the Egyptians were very obsessed with the afterlife and preserving bodies. Tombs and treasures were buried with the deceased, with complimentary inscriptions by stonemasons dedicated to them, with a series of pictures depicting them ascending to be with the quote gods and to become quote gods themselves. Peace be upon Asiyah, who didn't receive such a grand and elaborate burial. Let's just say that the burial of her body was somewhat more roughshod, but her soul was taken into eternal paradise before that happened. So what were the circumstances that led her temporary earthly life to this conclusion? Well, Queen Asiyah had everything in this life, except for one thing. She didn't have a child of her own.